We are at about 2 minutes.
Yeah, should be. Over and over, what's cited as justification for Israel's taking the land is simply that God promised it to Israel. Nothing is added about it being right for Israel to take it only if the inhabitants are exceedingly wicked. And over, what is cited as justification for extermination is that Israel is so susceptible to the lure of idolatry that the practitioners and paraphernalia of pagan worship must be eliminated if there is to be a people of Yahweh. But suppose Gary is correct in his interpretation cum extrapolation. Are God and Israel then in the clear with respect to the occupation of the land, the mode of occupation being another matter? I'm not sure. If God justly promised the land to Israel, then the land belongs to Israel, no problem there. But suppose that some 400 years intervened between the time God made the promise and the time Israel arrives at the borders of the land to occupy it. And suppose that in the meanwhile, a sizable number of thriving city-states have developed in the land. Does this or does this not cast doubt on the justice of the original open-ended promise? Shouldn't God have attached a qualifier? Shouldn't God have said, I gave you the land provided that when you're in a position to take it, it's virtually empty? No such qualification is hinted at. We know about such land gifts by the UN in the modern world. 2 more minutes. Suppose that the divine promise is indeed qualified, but not as I've just now suggested, provided it's empty, but as Gary suggests. I give you the land provided that just when you're in a position to take it, the inhabitants are exceedingly wicked. Would that promise have been a just promise? I don't know. I think there are complicated issues here. But now for my third and last point. Even if we answer that last question in the affirmative, yes, it would have been just, so that both God and Israel are so far in the clear, we've made no significant advance in determining what those of us who regard these texts as sacred are to do with them. For even if there is some way for Israel to take the land that leaves both God and Israel in the clear, there remains a stubborn fact that the texts present God on a literal reading as mandating genocide across the entire land, and present Israel again on a literal reading as obeying that mandate. Gary takes literally what the texts say about God relative to Israel. I hope I haven't misunderstood him, but adds that what they say about Israel's conquest is fictional. But if we don't take literally what the texts say about Yahweh's injunctions concerning Israel's mode of conquest, then we're up against the hard fact that the texts present Yahweh as mandating extermination of almost all the resident population. We can extract from the details of the story by asking whether it would have been right for Israel to take the land in some way or other, but they took it in this way. And I don't see any other solution to the problems here than a different line of interpretation. I repeat myself, these texts are highly stylized, metaphorical, hyperbolic, and the like. And how they present Israel's conquest of the land, it's very difficult to infer from them what actually happened, or even what God mandated to happen. These texts are not texts for the literal-minded.
Five minutes for Professor Anderson.
Be brief. Thank you very much, Professor Wolterstorff, for your response. I was honored, certainly, to have you as a respondent to my paper, and I thank the organizers for providentially arranging that. Microphone, okay. I guess it was interesting. I enjoyed your paper very much this morning, but I wanted to actually turn to your paper briefly in order to perhaps get at something in your reaction to my paper that was unclear. You said, really a central point of mine is the treatment of Genesis 15, when God tells the Israelites that they have to bide their time for 400 years because the sins of the Canaanites have not reached a sufficient number that God will be just to drive them from the land. You write over and over, the text declare that God attaches to Israel's abiding in land the condition that it remain faithful. This is a central point that the text hammer home to the reader. But I think we are extrapolating if we say that God likewise attached to Israel's taking of the land the condition that Gary suggests. Well, that's, of course, Genesis 15. in your own essay, when you're describing Calvin's position, which you certainly are right, my position is extraordinarily close to Calvin. I don't know if that makes me more comfortable or less comfortable, but we won't turn to that point now. You write, this is with respect to Calvin, it was because of the iniquity of the land had, quote, reached his height, says Calvin, that God was determined to destroy them. This was the origin of the command given to Moses. And then you have a footnote that says you don't understand this cryptic phraseology, that their iniquity had reached its height, nor do you know what he means their iniquity was complete. But Calvin, of course, there is citing Genesis 15. That's his intertext, as it is my intertext. So then you go on and you say, in saying that the rationale for the extermination command was God's desire to punish the Canaanite nations for their weakness, Calvin's going beyond what the texts of Deuteronomy and Joshua say. Well, that's certainly true. But what Calvin is doing is he's reading those texts through the lens of Genesis 15. He's taking the full canonical portrait. And that's extraordinarily important because the taking of the land in Deuteronomy, the Joshua and Judges, is the completion of the promise made to Abraham. So we need those narratives. And Calvin is making, a very, in my view, good move. Of course, it's my move. So I'm complimenting myself by complimenting Calvin, which is not very morally virtuous, but then again, I am a fallen man. So continuing here, you say, Calvin is going beyond what the texts of Deuteronomy and Joshua say. So that's how I must understand you here. You say that I'm not following the text, but I think I'm following the text actually very closely. I'm not sure, and at least the way you've understood Calvin, that you've understood the text that he's following. You say, so continuing, Calvin realizes that the fact that Yahweh, or I would prefer to say, I don't like to pronounce the divine name. I don't think that's appropriate, certainly not within Judaism, but even within Christianity, so I will stop. Calvin realizes the fact that the Lord chose not to exterminate the nations present in the land by some act of God, but rather by employing Israel as his agent, for it was and is God's will that the nations act justly in their prosecution of warfare, so on and so forth. Well, anyways, that's basically my point. In other words, I think what I would like to ask you maybe in reply is your inability to understand Calvin also reflected in your inability to understand me in this paper, or is there perhaps some other issue I haven't understood? Why, in other words, why isn't Genesis 15 the lens through which we read, Joshua and Judges?
Point taken. I admit I wasn't thinking about Genesis 15. I'll think about it. So I'll think about you and Calvin together on this issue.
Just remember, I'm not for double predestination. I'm with Thomas Aquinas on that.
Good point, Gary.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I'll begin with questions. Let's start over here with the first hand. If you would keep your hands up, I will add you to the queue and acknowledge you, but go ahead and start over here.
Okay, so this is for Professor Anderson. Toward the end of your paper, in the final paragraph, you say, in Abraham's day, the Canaanites were granted some 400 years to amend their ways. That suggests that the promise of the land to Israel was conditional on the Canaanites not actually amending their ways. But as I read Genesis 15, the Lord is saying to Abraham, this land is going to be yours, you've just got to wait a while. That is to say, he's not contemplating the possibility that the Canaanites would ever amend their ways.
That's a very, sorry.
I'm sorry?
I was ready to answer, but if you still want to.
If the point is clear, let's go ahead with your answer.
That's a classic problem in the Bible. The Bible bequests, of course, to its interpreters, which is the relationship between God's determination, providential guidance of all human affairs, and human free will. By the same token, there are certain texts that present the matter in such a way that God's actions seem to be predetermined, and the human actions seem to follow from what seems to be a unilateral prediction, and others that work the other way. I think the Bible's not a philosophical text, but it wants to assert that both are true at the same time. And the Bible's not going to solve that. So I wouldn't want to read that. I mean,